What's going on, everyone? We are on part 3 of the Jango and Meta saga. A little bit of a joke there, but also kind of true. We are talking about the tournaments. We finally have kind of the complete top 8 breakdowns. I went over the breakdowns of the overall meta field, being that Jango was around 26% of the sector qualifier in Milan, but now we're actually getting top 8 results from not only Milan, but also the Bothan Invitational Pool 1 and Pool 2. So we get to see, okay, yes, Jango might be 26% of the meta, but are we converting to wins with Jango? Or is it like, okay, he was winning 26% of the top 8s, or like getting 2 of the top 8s roughly, even though we have 26% of the meta, it's kind of converting reasonably evenly, which is already pretty good. What's the status of all this stuff? Because we've talked about, okay, here are some options to ban him, here are some options to restrict some cards, what about Triple Dark Raid? Is Jango actually a problem? Guys, he actually is a problem. Let's just say that. Let's get this out of the way, okay? I'm putting my foot down officially. Yeah, he seems like he's going to potentially have to get reviewed just based on early results. Of course, this can change. I'm open to new data, but if anyone has played set 4, you already know what Jango's capable of. It is an oppressive deck. And I'm not going to waste any more time, guys. Let's just jump right into it. Here are the results from Pool 2 of the Atlanta. This was the top 8 here of day 2, essentially. We have 4 of the top 8s being Jango red. We also have 2 Quinlan reds, 1 Sabine green, and a Han green in the top 8. Okay, yes, this is about 50% of the top 8s. Like, that's what it is for this one specifically, this specific tournament. That is absolutely the same sort of situation we were seeing with Boba Fett. And that was the thing that FFG absolutely did not want to see. Okay, what about the other 6K or the other portion of the Atlanta tournament? Day 1, essentially. Well, this one was a little bit more interesting. We had 2 Jango reds. We had a Cad blue. We had Quinlan green, we had double yellow Han, and we also had Cad green, we also had Major Von Reg yellow, and a Sabine green. So a pretty big spread. Okay, that is what's going on. I will say the Colossus list is pretty cool. I think that's worth, diving into. If you guys are curious, it is a pretty decent matchup against Jango red, so just something to consider. But then we dive into Milan, the biggest of these tournaments, and the one that I mentioned, we had 26% of the Jango field. 7 of the top 8s were Jango red. And the last one was a Piet yellow. 7 of the top 8s were Jango red, with a 26% Jango red initial fielding. The conversion rate on that is absolutely insane, right? A quarter of the meta was Jango red, but then we have 7 of the 8 top 8s being Jango red. It is incredibly powerful. Jango red is disgusting. And mind you, this isn't just like, okay, top 8. Jango red took down the Atlanta 6K on day 2. It got 4th and 5th slots on day 1 of the Atlanta, and then actually won the 546 player sector qualifier. So it's not just getting the top 8, it's not just fielding a majority of the meta, but it's also taking down the tournaments themselves. 2 of the first 3 big tournaments that we're seeing from Jump to Light Speed are taken down by Jango red. This is a lot. If you do the combination of all 3 of these top 8s, we have 13 of the 24 top 8s being Jango Fett. That is more than 50% of top 8s, and it's also a significant portion of the initial fieldings. So regardless of what anyone else had to say, including myself in previous videos or in previous topics, hey, Jango Fett, we'll see where he's at. I think he might cause some trouble is what I said initially. He's looking to be a good portion of the field. I could absolutely see him causing some trouble. I don't doubt that in the future with this result from Jango Fett, that Jango Fett will continuously see more and more and more play. When you have this amount of players coming in actually topping tournaments with Jango Fett, the amount of people that are going to flock to that deck, seeing how strong the deck actually is going to be massive. The same exact thing happened with Boba Fett. And guys, like, this is an absolutely massive portion of the meta. I've talked about how, like, oh yeah, we have 20, maybe 25% of the meta being a deck. Okay, that's not really cause for concern. This is over 50% of the competitive finishes. And just to give you an idea here, okay, just to give you an idea, look at this, okay? Look at this. This was the article. And again, these are not my specific judgments. This is just my predictions based on what FFG has said, which is, guys, Boba Fett for planetary qualifiers, 40% of top 8 finishes and more than 55% of winners. Okay. And then down here, if I forget where it's part, but if we control F for March, our next W will be March 2025. And then we're going to be updating it every few months after that. Well, if we look at Jango Fett just at the initial tournaments, we are more than 50% of top 8 finishes right now. Now that could drop down, but I actually don't think it will. I think it will actually go a little bit higher, and it has good potential to do so, unless a large portion of the meta starts to dive into specific Jango counters, which would be hard to do because there's only specific decks that can do that. And then those decks usually don't perform as well against the vast majority of the meta. So for them to be able to top 8 is pretty rough. But if you do find yourself in a situation where all of your top 8 finishes are all Jango Reds, then you might actually have a good shot at actually taking down the tournament because you have all good matchups. Regardless of, even if people are starting to play a bunch of decks to counter Jango Red, that type of cycling of the meta where you have so much of one portion of the meta that is actually competitive to where everyone's playing that deck, so then people are playing the counters to that list, and then they're succeeding just because a large portion of the meta is the Jango Red, that's a pretty unhealthy meta. It's just a pretty unhealthy meta. So at this point, I am pretty interested in seeing what FFG's decision is going to be, okay? Because this is right in line with what they had talked about, like literally right in line with what they had talked about. They said that's far above the line of an acceptable metagame share for a single leader, far above the line. And we are above the top 8 finishes and the winners. Now, again, the winners are a little bit not really a good data point to use right now because there's only 3 tournaments, but far above the top 8 finishes of Jango, or of Boba Fett with Jango. We are more than what Boba Fett was, and Boba Fett was far above the line. So again, Jango Fett is at the point where, yeah, FFG has to do something about this in terms of their own words. Not in terms of what I think, not in terms of what everyone else thinks, in terms of what they had claimed in previous articles, they've got to do something about this, period. Regardless of any other thought. Now, if you want to talk opinions of the community, well, the community is pretty fed up as well. They're kind of annoyed about Jango Fett. One of the big things about Jango Fett that makes it so oppressive is one of the things with Star Wars Unlimited is each person is taking their actions back and forth, which means everyone gets to kind of participate within the game. And a good portion of the games come down to unit combat in terms of damaging the base or damaging other units. Jango Fett completely flips that balance to one side. You no longer get that back and forth action because Jango Fett's constantly exhausting your units, so you can't even take your actions. And your whole deck, if you're racing, can't get into the races because you're getting your units exhausted, so you can't deal damage. You can't interact with their units because your units are exhausted again, so if you're using unit combat to deal with other units, that doesn't work. And that's what makes Jango Fett not just oppressive, but also pretty unfun for a lot of people to play against. And I'm with that group in that Jango Fett, if I'm playing up against Jango Fett, it really does ruin a lot of potential strategies. And it also just makes it a little bit less fun to play a lot of decks because you can't really do your game plan. Because again, you're getting exhausted throughout the entire portion. Now, I don't think it's like completely ridiculous in terms of like when I play against it, I'm not like, oh my gosh, this is over. Like there is ways to beat it. It's not unbeatable, but it is at that kind of point just based on what we're seeing. Okay. So it absolutely should be looked at, period. I 100% am in that camp. It's just not fun to see the full tournament top 8 going through coverage and just seeing Jango red mirrors across the board. Like, that is what we're seeing right now in a lot of situations. I mean, again, if you look through the top 8s of some of these lists, like the first and second, guess what? That was a Jango mirror. Obviously, Piet had a couple matches where it was Jango versus Piet, but then we also had more Jango mirrors in the, initial quarterfinals here. If you look at this, it was a Jango red mirror at the final of the 6K from day 2. Like, this is a lot, okay, of Jango. And not only does FFG need to take a look at this just because of what they said in the past, but also a lot of people are starting to become really disenfranchised with the competitive scene because of Jango. I do think it needs to be looked at. And for anyone that was saying, like, hey, I would love to see what they could do about Jango outside of just banning the leader, I think those conversations are absolutely viable. I've seen a lot of situations talking about, hey, triple dark raid is a problem, and that should be the one that's banned. Some people are saying, okay, well, War Juggernaut actually is the key piece, and that's one of the best things that you've gotten from set 4, and that needs to be adjusted. Well, what about IG 2000 and Devastator? Maybe we could reduce the copies of those. Those types of conversations I think are completely viable. I'm just not sure if FFG is in that spot where they'd rather ban a brand new set 4 card or restrict those versus just taking away a presumably very strong leader. But here's where it gets a little bit interesting, in that Cunning just seems to be a ridiculous archetype, like or aspect. If you look just through these lists, we have 7. Actually, we'll start from the beginning. On day 2, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 decks with Cunning in them. Okay, that's a lot. 0 vigilance, by the way, and only 2 running command. So definitely a huge skew towards certain aspects. For day 1, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the 8 decks running Cunning. Again, 1 vigilance user, 2 or 3 command users, 4 aggression. So, okay, reasonably split, but Cunning's definitely above them. Okay, for the other tournament, all 8 top 8 lists were using Cunning. 1 command aspect and 0 vigilance aspects. It is incredibly skewed towards Cunning right now, which may just be a fact of them unable to be balancing Cunning all that well. And this is something that I think is something to talk about, because Cunning is a unique aspect in that it really does double down on what I was saying earlier about Jango in general, which is it kind of breaks the symmetry of what Star Wars Unlimited is all about, where, okay, you're doing an action, I'm doing an action, we're able to interact with each other. Yes, people would say, okay, well, Vigilance does the same thing, where you can't interact with them because they just stop whatever you're doing. In some sense, that can be the case, but Cunning does it in a way where it cheats on resources, or it prevents you from doing actions while keeping your units on the board. It's almost a little bit more irritating for a lot of people. Not that I hate Cunning or anything like that, because it's my favorite aspect. It's the most fun. I think a lot of people would agree with that. It's also just fun to win. Cunning is a strong aspect. But Cunning in general seems to have a stronger portion of cards, and their power level seems to be stronger in general. Whether that's because of the leaders or just because of the aspect in general, I think in general it's going to be because of the aspect, right? If you look, just the cards that are in Cunning just do so well. Heck, even like the double aspect cards, if you compare all of them, Cunning would be like above the others by a far margin. Secondarily, it would probably be like Vigilance, as that's the other one that's seen the most play, just how strong that is, and then follow that up with like Command and Aggression, depending on how you look at things. But if you just look at what they're capable of doing, Cunning seems to be a big problem as well, just in terms of maybe looking at the potential balance. And maybe this is just a result of Jango, right? And this is something that I do think would be interesting to see in the following weeks if Jango does get an alteration, because people are considering, okay, yeah, if you ban Triple Dark Raid, like it removes some other decks, but it also opens up a lot of decks. And that is a fair argument, which is Triple Dark Raid, if you're banning for Jango, or if you just ban Jango entirely, there are a lot of different archetypes and decks that can actually enter their way into the meta because of us removing such an oppressive style. And it's the same thing that happened with Boba Fett. When Boba Fett was banned and we had the start of set 3, we had a really nice meta. And even at the end of set 3, where I talked about Han and is Han going to be banned in March, I think that was potentially the case. if we saw the continuation of Han dominance, because it was dominant, but it wasn't like oppressively dominant. And I think that was something that we could have had, but because they had so much support for Jango and not really a lot of support for Han, we saw Jango just be blowing every other deck out of the water. And with set 3, yes, Han was 20%, or Han Yellow specifically was 19% of the meta. Han Leaders were like 34% of the meta. So that was something to consider. But there were a lot more options in terms of leader viability and leaders that we saw. So it was a much healthier meta after we saw Boba ban. But now with one of the leaders from set 3 being one of the top 5 leaders in Jango Red, getting so many new cards associated with it, now we enter into a new stage where it's like, okay, if FFG is looking to do a balance update in March, and if this is the current state of the meta, something is going to happen, period. That's just kind of a result. If they stall on doing a balance change and they say, okay, you know what, it's a little bit too early, I know we said March, we're going to wait another month or whatever, and we'll see how the meta shakes up, then there is a chance that maybe Jango drops in popularity. I don't think so. I don't think that would happen, but we will see. It's definitely something that is on the forefront of the community's mind. It is definitely something to consider. And I'm very curious to hear what you all have to say about this at this stage. Because again, while my opinion does lie in that, yeah, Jango probably needs to have something addressed, period, just based on what we're seeing. It isn't like I am completely done with competitive play or anything like that, because I still just enjoy the game. It's not to the point where I'm feeling like oppressed and I can't play the game or I can't do anything, but I know a lot of other people feel like that. So it is interesting to hear what other experience is with the competitive meta. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all for the next one.